Today we're going to discuss supporting English language learners' language development. And this will be great for any teachers who are looking to become ESL certified, any pre-service teachers that are interested in developing their skills to serve English language learners, which now make up 10% of our U.S. student population. And in Texas, where I am from, it makes the English language learners make up 20% of our student population. It also will be beneficial for students who are studying for the PPR exam. This applies directly to Competency 8. All right, so let's get into the content. So to begin, one strategy to help support English language learners is to make sure that you provide learning scaffolds or supports. There's different types of learning scaffolds, and these are beneficial for any kind of person who's trying to learn a second language, not just for English language learners, but also, let's say you are a native English speaker, but you're trying to learn Spanish or Mandarin Chinese. These would be beneficial. Also, these in general are often pretty good strategies in general for teaching, so they can be supportive of students in all content areas as well. So some examples might be graphic organizers. Please see my earlier video about engaging instructional activities. I go into detail about graphic organizers. Another way to support English language learners is to provide mixed ability grouping, where you group students with someone who's a more fluent English speaker. That way, that more fluent English speaker can model correct English phrasing, correct pronunciation, and academic vocabulary. Sentence stems are also beneficial. So when students are developing their oral language skills or also their writing skills, helping them with a sentence stem that kind of starts them out with a sentence can be beneficial. So here's an example. Like the main idea of the story is, and then the students just have to fill in the rest. So sentence stems support ELL students because they help model correct phrasing, but also it's less of a cognitive load on students because they have that support. They have to just focus on that one element of language that they're targeting for that specific lesson. Another way to support ELL students is modified or differentiated text. So based on students' reading level, which you should do a reading assessment like DRA or Huntus and Pinnell, after you find out students' reading level, then you can match content area topics to texts that are written at students' reading level. So even if you're, let's say, a fourth grade teacher and you're teaching maybe natural resources, you can still find texts that go over that grade level content, but they're modified to meet students at their current reading level. And so that's really important. That way students can read independently while also learning the content. Pre-teaching academic vocabulary is very beneficial. That way students aren't lost during the lesson. Try to do it in an engaging way. Once again, please refer to my earlier video about engaging teaching strategies. I go into specific ways you can review academic vocabulary that are fun. Bilingual dictionaries are beneficial. They're supportive. Anchor charts, where the teacher writes down key steps to the lesson or key steps to remember when doing a certain activity. These are wonderful, and students can reference them if they ever are doing work independently or in small groups and the teacher is busy helping another student or another group. The students can refer to the anchor chart on their own and hopefully teach themselves. Teaching learning strategies are very beneficial, and I'll try to make another video on learning strategies because it's a little bit more of a complex topic, but basically teaching them how to read for comprehension, reread if necessary, read for particular details. Other learning strategies could be working collaboratively with another person. That's an effective strategy. So I'll go into that in another lesson. Another thing is to make sure that when you're teaching a lesson, don't teach the entire lesson all at once. Break it into chunks or manageable pieces And then after each chunk of new information, so each new major piece of information you introduce, stop and check for understanding. So have students write a summary of what they learned, ask questions, give them an activity where they practice with the content. That way, it's a lot more manageable than having to remember this whole large lesson and all aspects of it. Small group support is very beneficial, especially if the teacher is leading them. Providing students with small group support, especially if they're all on the same reading level or the same academic level, they're all struggling with the same type of question or the same type of problem. This would be beneficial because you can group students based on their needs and then meet them where they're at and provide targeted instruction to support them. Picture dictionaries are very beneficial because it develops students' academic vocabulary and it also provides that visual scaffold. So maybe if they don't understand all the words on the text, they can still understand, for the most part, the picture. All right. The second thing to remember about English language learners and how to best support them is you need to provide explicit vocabulary instruction. Research has shown that English language learners truly benefit from having targeted, direct instruction on vocabulary. So first of all, one way to check is to make sure to give a pretest on students' knowledge of fundamental content vocabulary words. And I included a link from Sealy Independent School District. It's really interesting. It's really beneficial. What they've done is they broke down each content subject like math, science, social studies, and they found the most important vocabulary words for each grade level. And so you might want to give students at the beginning of the year a pretest on those grade level vocabulary words. And if they don't know those particular words and you're about to teach a lesson that has that word in it, make sure you pre-teach that vocabulary so that they know what you're talking about during the lesson. Also, just before each lesson, it's important to pre-teach at least 2 to 3 new vocabulary words because for the most part, they've done studies and vocabulary knowledge is directly linked to students' reading comprehension and also listening comprehension. So if they don't know the key words you're talking about during the lesson, they're not going to understand the lesson. So make sure you pre-teach it ahead of time. That way you don't have to stop the entire lesson and go over that word, or you don't lose students who aren't familiar with those words. So example, I gave a 5th grade history lesson. Some words that students might need to know that you would pre-teach to students could be Constitution, rights, declaration, independence. Some of those words students might know, but many of them don't. And so you need to make sure you go over those before you actually get into the historical parts in our history where you discuss those elements. So they've done research on the best practices for vocabulary instruction, So they've shown that research says that students should focus on learning individual words. They should also learn word learning strategies. So how to use context clues to determine the meaning of unknown words, how to group words based on similar characteristics like having the same prefix like rewrite, redo, replay, reorganize. So those are some word learning strategies. Also, just developing word consciousness is important. So developing in your students a passion for learning about words. So maybe have a word of the day where students do their own research and they come up with a new word they learned at home the night before. Or maybe have a time of day where you dedicate just to opportunities for students to practice with words, using word sorts, or using words in a sentence, playing word learning games with their partner or with the classroom, such as like academic taboo, or maybe even pulling a word from the hat and having to use it in a sentence. All of these things kind of foster a love of learning words, which ends up helping develop students' overall vocabulary skills. So there's 3 types of academic vocabulary, and this is really important because even though this lesson is primarily for supporting teachers and how they best instruct English language learners, This also would be beneficial for all types of learners. And the reason why is because academic vocabulary is, in general, a second language for all people. For the most part, unless you're very well educated and your parents are well educated, and there's lots of books at home, and you're regularly interacting with academic texts at home, you probably will not be using a lot of academic vocabulary in your home lives. Even if let's say you are a native English speaker, you're mostly using informal language, everyday language, or even slang. And so academic vocabulary is something that all students are learning, but especially English language learners. And so it's important to understand that there's three types of academic vocabulary. First of all, there's content vocabulary. So these are vocabulary terms that are specific to unique to one particular content area. Normally, they're highlighted in textbooks. So an example might be photosynthesis. That's unique to the field of science. Then there's also general academic vocabulary words, which are normally cross-curricular. Sorry, I have a lot of allergies. So in these situations, these are especially beneficial to teach to students because they're going to not just see it in your class, but they're going to see it across other content areas, and they're probably going to see it in future grades. So many times, these kinds of words involve actions or thinking processes like apply, discuss, measure. Students really need to know those concepts because they're going to see that in different areas. Also, transitional words. No matter what text they're reading and what content area, they're going to need to know these transitional words to understand the sequence and also the order and how the author develops their argument. And then tools, words about tools like charts, diagrams, images, all of those words that are relevant to those, to interpreting and using those tools are beneficial across content areas. And then the third type of academic vocabulary are word parts. And these could be like roots and affixes. So we have prefixes, and we've talked about these in earlier videos, but like re, un, in. So they're parts of, they're word parts that come at the beginning of a sentence. Then you have the suffixes like full, less. And then you also have root words. And they normally come from Latin or Greek. Not always, but many times they come from those languages. And so an example might be aqua for water or mal for bad. And don't have students memorize a list. That's not going to be a very effective instructional strategy. Students are going to get bored. They've done studies, and most people can only retain about 7 to 10 new pieces of information at a time. So if you give them a long list of vocabulary words, they're probably only going to remember a few of them for a significant amount of time. They're only going to store maybe 7 to 10 of those in their long-term memory. So instead, you want to connect words to what students already know, and you also want to provide repeated connections and practice. So having students use it in different ways. So having students come up with their own definition, draw a picture of the vocabulary word, use the word in a sentence, find synonyms and antonyms of the word to connect it to previous learned words, playing, once again, vocabulary games. So we've talked about word consciousness already. Part of it also is important is make sure that you show and indicate a passion for learning words. If you are always trying to develop your vocabulary and sharing with your students new words you've learned, and it could be in English or it could be in a second language you're learning. Maybe you're learning your students' native language. If you show a passion and your interest and you devote it to part of the time of the day to really examine vocabulary words, students will start to do it on their own. It'll be contagious, and they'll automatically at home want to learn new words, and this will expand their academic vocabulary. So some things to remember when you're teaching academic vocabulary. First of all, make sure you incorporate the learner in the process. So make sure you have the students help you find and identify key vocabulary words that they should learn. Also, have them use vocabulary words in various ways. So maybe have a word sort where words that are synonyms or antonyms or words that have similar prefixes. Maybe have I kind of talked about it already, but use graphic organizers like a Four Corners vocabulary chart or a Friar model where they have to represent their vocabulary word in various ways. Also, make sure students personalize their learning when they're, especially when it comes to vocabulary. So, have students develop their own personal dictionaries or create their own mnemonic strategies to remember hard words, or have them create their own tools or memory techniques to remember new vocabulary words related to the content area you're teaching. And also make sure that you develop a rich language environment. So in your classroom, no matter what content area you teach, you could have word walls where you post the academic vocabulary terms based on the first letter that each word starts with. You know, A, B, C, D. For A, you would have, depending on what grade level, you might have act and add, and but if you're teaching older students, it might be absolve or abdicate, or so it really depends on the grade level, but you can make it based on your target content area and grade level. Also, spend time comparing and contrasting words. Play word origination games where students have to create their own word given a specific morphemic element, like a root word like scribe. So transcribe, scribe, script, they have to think of their own word. So word generation games are fun. Make sure students have multiple sources of words. So they're not just seeing the word once in their textbook, they're also seeing it in other texts that they're reading. They're seeing it maybe read out loud to them. They're seeing it in videos, academic videos, instructional videos, or instructional podcasts or audio exposures to the word. You want them to see the word several times, not just in one context, because words don't just only appear in one book or one context, they appear cross context. So you want to give them exposure to different types of word, to different opportunities to see that word applied in real life. Also, when you're thinking about words, try to make sure that you assign words that are relevant to students' language ability. So if they're just a beginner English language learner and they're just starting out learning English, having really complicated academic vocabulary terms are not going to be beneficial for that student. They need the fundamental, foundational, high-frequency words. So you might want to make sure they understand the Fry's list of 500 or even 1,000 high-frequency words that are the most common in texts. Or you might go over like that Sealy ISD content area chart if they're intermediate or advanced English language learners, to make sure they have that fundamental, foundational content area vocabulary. Another thing is you also have to think about what vocabulary words would be essential for understanding that particular passage, that particular lesson. You want to make sure you teach those vocabulary words. Also, you want to teach high utility vocabulary words, so words that they'll see often throughout, not just in this class, but in other classes and in other texts. Sorry, a lot of allergies. Another thing is start with high-frequency vocabulary. I've already mentioned that, but there's several lists that give you high-frequency vocabulary terms. So you want to make sure all students understand those and can use those in their own sentences, create their own sentences with them, and apply them before you start teaching them really complex academic vocabulary. So another thing to do is try to use a visual representation. So I used Fry's high-frequency words. So for like the first 100, I made a visual for write or see. But when you're getting into higher level words like the first 500 that are more academic in nature, surface or government. And then finally the first 1,000 like industry or column. Having ways to represent those words visually really support students, especially if they're English language learners. Another thing to note is you want to make sure that you teach words in context. So you want to provide an accompanying text or paragraph where they use the word in the sentence. Picture dictionaries are very beneficial. Having students come up with their own personal connection, like where they've seen this before, how can they use it in their own life, or how can they write a sentence about how they've used this word or seen this word in their own lives. And then repeated practice. That's really important. The average person needs at least 10 repetitions probably, but other students might need more, like 20, 30 more. So the more practice and repetitions they use the word in context, the better. So here are some vocabulary activities. I think I've talked about these in other videos, but just to briefly go over it. Word sorts, you're basically sorting or grouping words based on similar characteristics. The vocabulary self-collection strategy is where students, after reading a text, think of their own most important words. They write them in a journal, and then they come up with their own definitions, and then check their definitions with a dictionary. Word walls, we've discussed those. Personal dictionaries, we've discussed those a little bit already. Those are beneficial because that makes it meaningful for the individual student. And also it's something that tangible that students can take with them, and they can reflect on all the words they've learned throughout the year. So you might also devote part of your class time, maybe 5 to 10 minutes, where students work on adding academic words into their vocabulary, their personal vocabulary dictionaries. We mentioned this a little earlier, but Four Corners vocabulary charts is basically showing the vocabulary word in several contexts, letting them use it in their own sentence, coming up with their own definition, providing a visual, providing examples or non-examples. All of these are beneficial because it's multiple exposures to the word. Concept definition map is another graphic organizer similar to the Four Corners or Fryer model. Closed sentences are beneficial in that they're basically like fill-in-the-blank sentences, but it teaches students to use context clues in a sentence to understand what could be that unknown word. And so you could provide it, like if you could introduce new vocabulary by providing closed sentences and then providing the vocabulary terms with the visuals at the top. And then later, when students have seen the words and practiced with the words over and over, you might take away that scaffold of the visuals and have students just complete the closed sentences with just the vocabulary terms they've seen before, and then they have to match what they know about the vocabulary term to the particular context of the sentence. We talked about word generation. It's like a game where students create their own examples of words. There's, of course, Scrabble, crosswords, all kinds of fun vocabulary games that could be high yield and that they make students engaged and they're more likely to remember the words. I talked about this earlier in the video, but academic taboo game, you might have different cards and students have to explain their academic vocabulary term to their partner or to their group, and it could be a competition. And it challenges students to think of new words and to circumlocute or to explain the way of a word using other words. So explaining a new word using other words they already know. So circumlocution is beneficial because let's say you're in a conversation with someone who doesn't understand you or didn't understand that word. Well, circumlocution teaches you how to explain it in a new way using words that listener understands. So it's beneficial for students to practice. And it also teaches them critical thinking skills because they have to expand on and think critically to describe the word in a way that maybe they hadn't thought of before, and using other words to describe a common term. It also expands their vocabulary in general because if students are listening to other students describe words using new terms, they can hopefully internalize those new words as well. Word association circle, it's also kind of a graphic organizer, but it's the same thing. If students do this collaboratively, similar to the academic taboo game, students can build upon each other's word knowledge. So if they do it together, then students might learn new words that their partner suggested that relate to the word. Word lottery is a fun game where there's different boxes for nouns, verbs, objects, adjectives, adverbs, and then students pick a few and then they have to come up with a sentence. So it's also a creative, critical thinking strategy while using words interactively. Vocabulary bingo, that's kind of self-explanatory. You've probably played this before, but one thing to note is I like to have it where I write the question on the board and I make it in the form of a closed sentence. This way students have to use their context clues and they have to use their context clues to match it with the appropriate vocabulary term. And if there are new words, or depending on the English level of students, you might want to provide them with visual scaffolds to support them in this activity. So a third important thing to do is that you must explicitly teach elements of language. So English language learners might be coming from a native language background that has different foundations of language. So they probably will have these elements that I'm about to go over, but it might be unique and different than the way we have it in English. So it's important to know these terms. So first of all, phonemes. So phonemes are the sounds of a language. The good thing is most languages have a similar amount of phonemes. There's about 150 sounds that a human's voice box can make. And so, fortunately, most languages have similar sounds. They just obviously don't write them the same way. So you might have to teach your students how the long A sound is spelled and what it looks like in English. So, for example, the long A sound in cave or ray. So phonics are connecting phonemes to specific letters. And phonics is also about the ability to decode letters and to read words accurately. And so this is probably the key element because students first need to know the phonemes, like the alphabet and the sounds that the different letters make, but they also need to know how, when you combine letters together, what is their blend or what is their digraph and sound so that they can help decode and read words accurately. Morphemes are part of words. So example might be adding an S or an ed or an ing all changes the meaning of a word. It changes the tense, and so the context in which the word, for example, the verb is applied. Prefixes, we've talked about those. Those are morphemes. Root words and suffixes are all morphemes. So explicitly teaching those are beneficial. Syntax is very important, and we're going to go into more detail about that in a second. But syntax is useful because many languages do not have the same syntax as English. Syntax is basically how words are ordered in a sentence. It's grammar, how to correctly organize and structure a sentence, including the parts of speech, so like nouns, verbs, objects. And so this is really important because not all languages have the same syntax pattern. So in English, we normally go subject, verb, then adjective, and then object. So I have a cool phone. Well, in Spanish, for example, it's different. It goes subject, verb, object, and then for the most part, adjective after. So in Spanish, it would be yo tengo un teléfono chido or chévere or bueno. So the descriptive word, chido, which is like the informal word for cool, would be after the noun teléfono. So semantics are also beneficial. Semantics are understanding the meaning of complete sentences. So using context clues, your prior academic vocabulary knowledge, your background knowledge on the topic, and your knowledge of the word parts like the different prefixes and root words and suffixes to understand the meaning of a complete sentence. So this is really important. You need to develop ELL students or English language learners' understanding of English syntax. We talked about this just earlier, but syntax, once again, is the phrasing and the structure of the sentence. Sometimes we hear of it or we learn of it in terms of parts of speech. Nouns, verbs, objects, adjectives, adverbs. So nouns, remember, are person, places, or things. Verbs are actions. Objects are also nouns, but they receive the action. Then we have adjectives, which are descriptive words that describe nouns, and then adverbs, which can describe adjectives, verbs, and other adverbs. So normally adverbs say how many or how much, and what, and adjectives are more like what kind, or what type, or what color. So it's important you explicitly teach English sentence patterns. Remember, we go subject, which is a noun, verb, and then object. So the subject does the action, then comes the verb, which is the action, and then we have the object. And then we also have descriptive words. So we have like articles that come before nouns that say how many or what type. So the, a, some, all of those are articles, and they come before an object. And then, of course, adjectives and adverbs. So adjectives describe nouns, and adverbs, and they become, in English, they come before the noun. So like, the pretty dog is here. So pretty is an adjective, so it comes before the noun dog. Also, adverbs, once again, they describe adjectives, other adverbs, and verbs come before the word they're describing for the most part. So she carefully finished her work. So carefully is the adverb, is describing how she finished her work, the verb. Adverbs normally end with an ly, but not always. And once again, for the most part, they come before the verb. So you need to teach this to students because they might not have seen this before. Or they might be from a language that maybe leaves out the subject, or some languages don't have the past tense, for example. They don't have verb tenses. So it's really important that you explicitly teach these elements to students because they might not have seen them before. So some strategies to help develop students' syntax knowledge. First of all, it's important to teach transition words. So transition words really help determine meaning. So as you can see, there's different types, right? There's addition transition words like moreover, furthermore. There's illustration, like for example, as an example. There's transition words that explain cause and effect. So consequently, as a result, thus. There's transition words to compare. All of these different ones. I would show students this handy chart. And I obviously did not develop it. I got it from this website. But also, you want to make sure students practice with that in context. So maybe students make their own sentences or have closed sentences where students have to fill in those transitional words. So another thing is you want to make sure you explicitly teach subordinate conjunctions. And the subordinate conjunctions are words that connect two ideas together. So an example might be because, to explain the reason, or so that, since. All of those are subordinating conjunctions. But there's other ones too, like that, which, rather than, after, whenever, although. And so there's a nice handy list right there. And teaching students those subordinating conjunctions at the appropriate grade level is important. So if you're teaching third grade, you might not teach though too much. You might introduce it, but that might not be the biggest word you focus on. But you will definitely want to make sure students understand the word who, or than, or if, or how. So it really depends on students' grade level and also their English level. But you want to start out with the more basic, fundamental, high-frequency subordinating conjunctions and later get to the more advanced. And make sure you're showing it in a sentence. So you're giving various examples or various texts that use the conjunction and then having students practice on their own where they make sentences using those conjunctions. Another thing is you should model proper syntax. And one way to do that is with sentence stems. Or sentence starters. So you want to make sure that students are seeing how to speak and write correctly. And the way to support students, especially if they are beginning or intermediate, English language learners is to provide them these sentence stems. They provide them the scaffold and support to model how to correctly phrase the sentence, and it also provides students with opportunities to practice proper phrasing. Another thing is, it might be, not might, but you should also try, depending on students' grade level, to also read pattern texts that feature the repetition of particular sentence patterns or particular syntax. So an example might be this passage right here. Brown bear, what do you see? I see a red bird looking at me. Red bird, what do you see? I see a yellow duck looking at me. So there, it's kind of modeling correct syntax. Brown is adjective describing bear, the noun. So adjective, noun. What do you see? So asking a question. I see a red bird looking at me. So students can model that by practicing and writing their own imitation or paraphrase or their own version of that poem themselves. And that way they're practicing with that sentence structure in a fun, creative way. All right, so those are all of our tips. There's additional tips for supporting ELL students. I'm going to come up with a video on how to teach each of the particular English language learner scaffolds and describing them in more detail. You can also see some of my TELPAS videos that I've made. I've made a video about engaging instructional activities. Those are particularly beneficial for English language learners. I've made videos about students' first and second language development and ESL teaching strategies in general. So please check out my other videos on my channel if you're interested in this topic. Thank you again for your attention, and for my students that took the time to listen to this. I appreciate it, and have a great day. Thank you. Bye. Gotta save it. Thank you. Have a great